Dolores Whitaker boarded the city bus expecting nothing more than a quiet ride home. When a drunken man demanded she move, his voice thick with entitlement, she met his glare without flinching. He saw an elderly black woman, someone who would give in, who would back down to avoid trouble. He had no idea that Dolores had spent her life standing against men like him. What started as a confrontation over a seat would ignite something far greater, a fight for dignity, a battle against a system that had looked the other way for too long. And by the time it was over, policies would be rewritten, a movement would rise, and the world would remember the woman who refused to move. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The city bus rumbled down the street, a tired machine dragging its way through the afternoon heat. The sun hung high, casting long streaks of gold across the pavement, bouncing off windshields, making the world shimmer like it was wrapped in thin glass. Inside, the air was thick with the usual mix of stale upholstery, sweat, and quiet indifference. A bubble of isolation where passengers sat in rigid silence, eyes glued to their phones, bodies swaying with each stop-and-go jolt. At the front of the bus, in the seat nearest to the door, sat Dolores Whitaker. 72 years old, back straight despite the weight of the years pressing against her bones, hands gripping the strap of her worn canvas grocery bag. The bag was heavy. Canned goods, fresh collard greens, a loaf of bread. Just enough to get her through the week. Her body ached, but she wouldn't let it show. She had always carried herself with quiet dignity, the kind her mother had taught her to have, no matter what the world threw her way. A widow, a mother, a grandmother, she had lived long enough to see history fold over itself, to watch things change, and yet somehow remain the same. She had been riding this bus for years, long enough to know its rhythm. The way the driver barely looked at the passengers, the way the young folks pretended not to see elderly people standing, the way nobody wanted to make eye contact, because eye contact could lead to responsibility. Dolores wasn't bitter. She understood the way things were. But she had never been one to accept disrespect, and that was exactly what was about to come her way. The doors hissed open at the next stop, and he stepped on. Loud, staggering, the stink of liquor seeping from his skin. Dolores didn't have to look up to feel the shift in the air. The beast had arrived. The bus jolted as the doors groaned open, letting in the sweltering afternoon heat, along with the heavy, staggering presence of the drunk man, Earl Pritchard. Big, red-faced, sweating beneath the strain of his own weight, his gut stretched against the fabric of a stained button-down that had once been white, but now carried the yellowed burden of time and poor hygiene. The scent of alcohol clung to him, thick and sour, creeping into the confined space like an unwelcome guest. He stepped onto the first stair, swaying slightly as the bus gave a small lurch forward, forcing him to grab the railing with an irritated grunt. His eyes, half-lidded, unfocused, dragged across the passengers, slow and assessing, like a predator deciding where to sink its teeth. The bus driver didn't say a word, just kept his eyes forward, foot on the pedal, eager to keep the route moving. Earl let out a grunt, a long exhale that reeked of whiskey. He took another step forward, his gaze sliding over a teenage boy with headphones, a middle-aged woman clutching her purse, an older man flipping through a worn-out newspaper. Then he saw her. Dolores Whitaker, sitting at the front of the bus, back straight, unshaken, present, his lip curled, his bloodshot eyes narrowed as if something inside him had just been offended. He took another step forward, then another, his large boots dragging against the rubber mat. Dolores felt him coming before she ever looked up. She had felt that kind of presence before, the slow-moving weight of a man who believed the world owed him something, and the resentment that came with realizing it didn't. A small hush spread through the bus. Passengers turned their gazes just slightly, not enough to be involved, just enough to know what was coming. Earl let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. He leaned on the nearest pole, his knuckles whitening around the metal as the bus lurched forward again. "Now ain't this something?" he muttered, his voice thick with liquor, almost amused. "Ain't this a sight?" Dolores finally looked up, her gaze steady, unwavering. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation, only the kind of quiet resilience that had been carved into her over the course of a lifetime. She had encountered men like him before, men who carried their entitlement like a birthright, their anger simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to spill over. She had seen them in her youth, standing in doorways with folded arms, their narrowed eyes full of challenge, waiting for someone like her to step out of line. She had seen them in workplaces, their dismissive glances and muttered insults disguised as jokes. She had seen them in grocery stores, in banks, in every corner of the world where men like Earl Pritchard believed they had the right to take up more space than everyone else. She had endured their scorn. She had faced their venom. And each time, she had outlasted them. And today would be no different. If this man thought she was going to shrink under his gaze, that she was going to bow her head and move to the back of the bus like he was the king of some forgotten kingdom, he was sorely mistaken. Dolores Whittaker had lived too long and fought too hard to let a drunken fool dictate where she could and couldn't sit. She wasn't going anywhere. Earl adjusted his stance, swaying like a leaning tree, gripping the pole tighter as the bus jolted forward. His eyes, red-rimmed and lazy from drinking, settled on Dolores with slow, deliberate intent, dragging over her in a way that made it clear he saw her as an offense, a mistake that needed to be corrected. "Look at this," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, but still in that half-drunken mumble, like he was talking to himself, making an observation that demanded validation. "Ain't no shame left in the world no more. Used to be a time when folks knew where they was supposed to be. Used to be a time when I could step on a bus and know, without even thinking about it, that I wasn't gonna have to sit behind one of you." Dolores kept her focus forward, smoothing the strap of her grocery bag over her lap, breathing evenly, not giving him a single piece of what he wanted. Earl shifted his weight, his boots dragging against the bus floor, the smell of cheap whiskey curling off his clothes in thick waves. "Never thought I'd see the day," he continued, his voice sharpening as he lifted his chin slightly, his expression tightening, the alcohol fueling every hateful thought he had ever swallowed down and giving him just enough recklessness to let them out. "A woman like you sitting up here like you got a right to it, like you supposed to be seen first when a man steps on the bus, like you belong at the front, like you ain't still what you are." He shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh, dragging a hand over his mouth before exhaling sharply. Dolores heard the hushed, uncertain shifting of the other passengers, the ones who had already decided they wouldn't be part of this, who had chosen to sit in silence and watch, hoping it wouldn't go too far, but unwilling to stop it before it did. She had been in situations like this before, had felt this same charged air, the kind that waited for one wrong movement to spark something bigger. Earl sniffed hard and let out a breath through his nose, the tension in his posture giving away the fact that her silence was getting to him, that the lack of a response was making him feel unacknowledged, and that men like him did not take kindly to being ignored. "You know, back in the day, you'd never see this. Never see some old black woman sitting up front, acting like she as good as the rest of us." His words dragged like nails on metal, his lips curling in something that wasn't quite a smile, a thin stretch of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes, because there was nothing amused about it. "Ain't right, ain't natural, not supposed to happen, and yet here you are, sitting there all high and mighty like the world just went ahead and forgot how things are supposed to be." Dolores did not react, did not shift, did not flinch. She had been through worse, had faced men more dangerous than this one, had learned long ago that nothing rattled men like him more than being refused the response they wanted. Earl licked his lips, the movement slow and deliberate, his expression twisting as his fingers flexed slightly where they gripped the metal bar, as if he needed something to hold on to, something to ground himself as his frustration swelled. He had been expecting something, waiting for an argument, for outrage, for her to shrink under his words, for her to give him something to feed on. But she had given him nothing, and the realization was starting to settle in his drunken mind, making him shift his stance again, making him lean in, just slightly, his breath thick with the sourness of beer and the heat of his own self-importance. "You people don't get it, do you?" His voice lowered, as if trying to pull her into the moment, as if dragging her down into his filth would make her acknowledge him. "Ain't nobody want to see you sittin' up here first thing they step on the bus? Ain't nobody want to see your kind sittin' where they don't belong? You don't belong here. You never did." Dolores inhaled deeply, the air slow and measured, as it passed through her nose, her fingers curling around the strap of her bag just enough to press into the fabric, her posture unwavering as she sat there, silent, letting the weight of his words press against her without sinking into her. Earl's grip on the pole tightened, his knuckles whitening, his lips pressing together as his chest rose slightly with another slow breath, the alcohol in his system making it harder for him to stay patient, making his frustration sharper with every second that passed without a reaction. His eyes flicked around the bus, scanning the faces of the passengers, looking for an ally, for someone to back him up, but all he saw were turned heads, lowered gazes, people pretending they weren't part of this, hoping that if they stayed quiet, they wouldn't have to acknowledge what was happening. It only made him angrier. When he turned back to Dolores, there was something new in his expression. Something meaner, something worse. The flicker of a man who was quickly realizing that if words wouldn't work, if his presence alone wasn't enough, he might need to take things a step further. And Dolores, in that moment, knew that this wasn't going to end with just words. The tension inside the bus had shifted, thickening into something heavy, something that settled in the air like a storm waiting to break open. Earl's drunken rambling had turned into a one-man performance, his voice rising in volume with each word, as if the sheer force of his anger could make up for the fact that no one was willing to validate him. Dolores still hadn't responded, hadn't even looked in his direction since that first glance, and the lack of engagement was eating him alive. Earl let out a sharp, bitter laugh, his large hand swiping across his mouth before he pushed off the pole, planting his feet wider, as if bracing himself, as if daring her to acknowledge him. "Oh, I see how it is now," he said, his voice no longer muttering but loud, forceful, taking up too much space in the enclosed bus. "You think you too good to answer? That it? You think if you just sit there, all quiet, all uppity, that I'm just gonna stop talking?" He scoffed, the sound thick with disdain, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Nah. See, that's the problem with your kind. Always acting like you better than you are. Always thinking you done earned something when you ain't done nothing but sit there, expecting the world to just hand you whatever you want." The bus lurched forward, the driver hitting the gas a little too hard, a subtle sign of his growing impatience. From the front, his low, disinterested voice carried back toward them, muttered more out of routine than concern. "Sir, you need to calm down," he said, not even bothering to look back. The words held no weight, no conviction. He wasn't intervening, he was just checking off the box of having said something before moving on. Earl let out another low, ugly chuckle, shaking his head. "Calm down? Now why would I do that?" He lifted his hands in mock innocence, his shoulders rising in an exaggerated shrug as he looked around the bus, waiting for someone, anyone, to back him up. "I ain't even done nothing yet. Just having a conversation. Ain't that right?" He turned back to Dolores, his teeth flashing in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Ain't we just talking, sweetheart?" Dolores finally moved. She didn't turn her head, didn't acknowledge him the way he wanted, but she reached into her grocery bag, calmly adjusting the contents, shifting the weight of her items as if she hadn't heard a single word he'd said. It was a small motion, a dismissal so absolute that it cut deeper than any argument could have. Earl's nostrils flared, his fingers curling at his sides. From across the aisle, an older white woman, someone who had been pretending to be engrossed in the view outside the window, suddenly cleared her throat. "I think she heard you just fine," the woman said, her voice tight, cautious. "You should leave her alone." Earl's head snapped toward her so fast, his entire body twisting with the motion, his eyes narrowing as if the words had physically struck him. "Oh, you got something to say now, huh?" He let out a short, humorless laugh, stepping sideways just enough to get a better look at her. "What? You think you get to tell me what to do? That what you think?" The woman's mouth pressed into a thin line, and suddenly she didn't have anything else to say. Earl snorted, shaking his head. "Figures. Ain't got the spine for it, do ya?" His attention snapped back to Dolores, the shift so sudden, so sharp, it felt like a whip crack in the air. And that was when he took another step forward. The tension that had been building, the thick, suffocating weight of it, finally tilted into something dangerous, and Dolores knew that the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had sensed was coming from the second he stepped onto the bus, had finally arrived. The bus rattled along its route, the world outside continuing as normal. But inside, the air had thickened into something unbearable. Conversations had died off completely. Passengers sat frozen in place, their eyes downcast or locked onto their screens, desperate to appear uninvolved. Earl's chest rose and fell with each uneven breath, the deep red of his face growing darker, flushed with heat and alcohol. He stared down at Dolores, still waiting, still expecting her to react. But when she remained poised, back straight, eyes forward, it was like throwing gasoline on his frustration. He had gotten away with so much already. He had berated her openly, thrown words at her with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the world had always let him do it. But she wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted, and it was driving him mad. Earl let out a sharp exhale through his nose, shaking his head. "Y'all always think you something special," he muttered, his tone now edged with something sharper, something meaner. "Think just 'cause you lived long enough, you done earned some kind of respect. Ain't nobody respectin' you, lady. Not one damn person on this bus thinks you belong sittin' up here like you're their equal." Dolores, who had remained silent for so long, who had refused to acknowledge his foolishness, finally spoke. Her voice, smooth and steady, cut through the stagnant air like a blade. "Oh, is that right?" Earl flinched, just slightly, just enough for her to see it. She turned her head for the first time, her dark eyes locking onto his, her expression unreadable, but there was weight behind it, gravity that settled into the space between them. "You want to know what I think?" she asked, her voice still calm, but carrying a quiet, unshakable authority. Earl said nothing. For the first time since he boarded the bus, he hesitated. Dolores took her time, adjusting the strap of her grocery bag before continuing, making sure that every word she spoke sank deep, made its way into his bloated, alcohol-soaked brain and stayed there. "I think men like you ain't never been worth a damn. Not then, not now, and not ever." Earl's jaw tightened. "You walk around puffin' up your chest like the world owe you something," she continued, her voice not rising, not needing to, "like people should bend when you talk. But see, that's the problem, ain't it? You're just mad the world don't work like it used to. You're mad that men like you don't scare people no more." A beat of silence. A pause, just long enough to let it sink in. Earl's fingers twitched at his sides. "You picked the wrong one today," Dolores said simply, shifting slightly in her seat, returning her attention to the window like he was no more significant than a buzzing fly. Earl let out a short, forced chuckle, but there was no humor in it. His tongue flicked out over his bottom lip, his mind working behind his eyes, the gears grinding painfully slow as he tried to process what had just happened. She had spoken, and worse, she had spoken without fear. For the first time since this started, he wasn't in control. He swallowed hard, glancing at the other passengers, trying to gauge if anyone had seen that moment where he had been knocked back on his heels. But still, No one met his eyes. No one reacted. The bus driver, in a half-hearted attempt to keep order, muttered again from the front, his voice dull, detached. "That's enough. Both of you just sit tight until your stops." Earl barely registered it. His hand curled into a loose fist, then relaxed. His fingers flexed against his thigh, his teeth grinding together, his jaw working as he tried to decide what to do next. Dolores had made him look small, and he couldn't stand it, but he had to be smart now. For the first time, he wasn't running on pure rage. He was thinking. The bus rocked forward, the hum of the engine filling the air. But no one on board was fooled. The bus rumbled along its route, its tired engine groaning with every bump in the road, the hum of transit filling the uneasy silence that had settled over the passengers. The momentary lull had done nothing to ease the tension, nothing to unwind the invisible rope that had been pulling tighter and tighter since Earl Pritchard first opened his mouth. The confrontation had not ended. It had simply quieted, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for something or someone to stir it back to life. The brakes hissed, the bus slowing to a stop at the next intersection, the mechanical sigh of the doors opening to reveal the next passenger. A middle-aged white man, in a crisp button-down and neatly pressed slacks, stepped onto the bus, his posture stiff, his face set in the kind of mild but ever-present discontent that came with a life of always feeling slightly inconvenienced. He barely spared a glance at the rows of passengers, his eyes moving directly toward the front of the bus, toward the empty seat near Dolores, then flicking toward the empty rows toward the back. He hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly, the briefest flicker of disapproval crossing his face, subtle but impossible to ignore. With a sigh that was just loud enough to be heard, just dramatic enough to be purposeful, he shifted his weight, adjusting the sleeve of his shirt, as if he had already made up his mind to be annoyed before he even spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite but carrying an unmistakable edge, the kind of forced civility that masked something uglier beneath the surface. "Maybe you should move back, you know? For the rest of us." The words were soft, but they landed like a stone thrown into still water, their impact rippling outward, shaking the silence, drawing attention without raising alarm. Dolores turned her head slightly, not enough to fully look at him, not enough to give him her full attention, but just enough to acknowledge that she had heard every word he had said, just enough to let him feel the weight of her noticing. Earl, who had been waiting, watching, stewing in the humiliation that had been brewing in his chest since she first spoke, latched onto the words like a drowning man grabbing hold of a rope. A short, triumphant laugh burst from his mouth, a sound full of vindication, his face splitting into a broad, smug grin as he turned toward the newcomer, nodding as if this moment had confirmed something for him, as if the universe had just handed him proof that he had been right all along. "See that?" he said, spreading his arms wide, his voice rising in volume, his excitement making his words sharper, cutting through the stagnant air. "Ain't just me saying it. Ain't just me telling you what's what. Other folks see it too. You sitting up here where you don't belong, taking up space you ain't earned, making a whole damn mess when all you gotta do is move." The man who had spoken hesitated, shifting his weight uncomfortably, suddenly realizing that he had stepped into something deeper than he had intended. He wasn't looking for an argument, wasn't looking to get involved, but now that his words had been seized upon, now that he had been dragged into Earl's tantrum, there was no easy way to back out. His lips pressed into a thin line, his hands tightening slightly at his sides as he cleared his throat and took a step back, muttering something unintelligible under his breath before turning his gaze toward the window, pretending he was no longer part of the conversation. But it was too late. Earl's attention had snapped back to Dolores, his smirk widening, his confidence growing, his body shifting forward as the alcohol in his system and the righteousness he felt from hearing someone else echo his sentiment emboldened him, feeding the fire that had been simmering in his chest since the moment he had stepped onto the bus. Dolores, just as she had done before, remained silent. Her hands rested lightly on her grocery bag, fingers relaxed but firm against the fabric. Her back still as straight as it had been since the beginning, her breathing even and measured. Earl's eyes flicked over her face, searching for something. A twitch, a flinch, a sign of discomfort, something that told him he was getting under her skin, but she gave him nothing. A muscle in his jaw flexed, his fingers twitching at his sides, and then he shoved her. Not hard, not enough to knock her over, not enough to make it look intentional, not enough that anyone could accuse him of outright violence, but enough. Enough to send a ripple of shock through the bus, enough to make the air shift, to make bodies tense, to make the tension that had been building finally crest over into something else. Enough to send a message. Dolores felt the press of his palm against her shoulder, the brief force of it, the way it lingered for a fraction of a second longer than it should have before he pulled away. A murmur rippled through the passengers, low and uneasy, a few shifting in their seats, a few glancing up, the energy in the air changing, sharpening, growing heavier by the second. The bus driver muttered something under his breath, still unwilling to fully intervene, still unwilling to stop this before it went any further. Dolores took a slow breath, her fingers curling slightly against her bag, feeling the weight of it in her lap, feeling the weight of everything around her, the weight of the moment pressing against her bones. The decision had been made. This was no longer just an exchange of words. Earl had touched her, and that meant everything had changed. Dolores exhaled slowly, feeling the tension still clinging to her shoulder where his hand had been. Her muscles tight but controlled, her mind clear despite the storm raging around her. She had spent a lifetime knowing men like Earl Pritchard, had stood her ground in moments far more dangerous than this one, and she had never needed to shout or flail or beg for respect. She had learned that a firm voice, steady hands, and an unshaken gaze could do far more damage than any raised fist ever could. She adjusted her grip on her grocery bag, straightened in her seat, and then, finally, she looked at him. Her dark eyes settled on his face, taking him in with a quiet, unwavering weight, measuring him with the kind of gaze that had made lesser men stumble over their own feet. "You put your hands on me again, and I promise you, you'll regret it." The words were not loud. They were not rushed. They did not come with theatrics or grand gestures. They did not need to. They landed like a stone dropping into a well, echoing outward, sinking deep, forcing the weight of them into every inch of the space between them. Earl blinked once, his breath hitching for just a fraction of a second, the briefest flicker of hesitation crossing his face before something meaner took its place. His mouth twisted, his teeth flashing in a wide, drunken grin, a hoarse, wheezing chuckle spilling from his lips as his shoulders shook with the weight of his own amusement. "You hear that?" he barked, turning his head slightly as if speaking to the invisible audience that he imagined was on his side. His laughter grew louder, spreading through the bus like a sickness, mocking, taunting, scraping at the edges of the already fragile silence. "She gonna make me regret it. Ain't that something? I got me a tough one here. A real fighter." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the air thick with unease, the kind that came when people knew something was wrong but weren't willing to step into the fire to stop it. A young woman near the back, barely in her 20s, had her phone raised slightly, camera already recording, the small red dot on the screen capturing every second of what was happening. But even she sat still. Even she didn't say a word. Another passenger, a man in his 40s, wearing a navy blue suit, turned his face toward the window, his jaw tightening, his fingers gripping the strap of his briefcase with knuckles white from tension. No one spoke. No one moved. They were witnessing something ugly, something that should not have been happening. But their silence was an unspoken agreement, an invisible contract between strangers who had already decided that it was better to stay out of it. The bus driver sighed, barely glancing up from the road, his shoulders rising with the weight of reluctant obligation before he muttered something under his breath. Low, disinterested, tired. "Both of you need to settle down," he said, voice as lifeless as a dying flame, as if this were nothing more than two people bickering, as if this were just another day, just another inconvenience, just another thing he could ignore until it went away. Earl scoffed, shaking his head, as his laughter died down into something closer to a smug exhale, a satisfied sound, as if he had already decided that he had won, that he had forced her into saying something, that he had gotten under her skin. He wobbled slightly where he stood, his weight shifting forward, his eyes still locked on her, gleaming with a kind of victory that came from knowing there would be no consequences, that no one would stop him, that this was still his moment, and that he could take it as far as he wanted. Dolores, however, was not afraid. She did not shrink, did not falter, did not so much as glance at the passengers who had chosen to look away. She had given her warning. She had said her piece. And now she would wait, because men like Earl never knew how to leave well enough alone. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, hanging over the bus like a storm ready to break open. And then, just as expected, Earl took another step closer. Earl swayed where he stood, the alcohol coursing through his veins, fueling the slow-burning frustration that had now turned into something uglier, something more desperate, something that refused to be ignored. His breath was uneven, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his own stubbornness. His mouth twisted into a smirk that lacked real amusement, his pride hanging by a thread after being humiliated in front of a bus full of passengers who had, up until now, been content to do nothing but watch. He had been challenged, and men like him did not take kindly to being challenged, did not know how to walk away without proving something, without taking something, without forcing the world to bend just enough to remind them that they still had power. Without hesitation, he reached out and grabbed Dolores's grocery bag, his fingers curling around the strap, his grip rough and unforgiving, his weight shifting as he attempted to yank it away from her, as if taking it from her would somehow make up for all the ways she had already made him feel small. The force of the pull jerked her forward slightly, her knuckles tightening around the strap, her muscles tensing as she refused to let go, refused to let this man take one more thing from her, refused to grant him the satisfaction of watching her submit. The struggle was immediate and silent, a battle that lasted only seconds but felt much longer as the tension in the space between them grew unbearable. The bus jostled over an uneven patch of road, the rattling of metal poles and overhead advertisements providing a backdrop to the quiet, uncomfortable shifting of passengers who could no longer pretend they weren't witnessing what was happening. No one moved to help. No one spoke up. Some lowered their eyes, others turned their heads. A few glanced toward the front of the bus, as if waiting for the driver to intervene. But when he made no effort to stop the situation from unfolding, their brief flickers of concern faded into the same passive disinterest they had held from the U. "Start!" Earl, fueled by his own arrogance, yanked harder, his arm flexing as he attempted to rip the bag away from Dolores with the assumption that she would not be strong enough to resist. But she had spent a lifetime resisting, had spent decades holding on to the things people like him had tried to take, had spent too many years learning that there was a different kind of strength in refusing to yield when the world expected her to. With precision and force, she shifted her stance, twisting her body just enough to break his hold before she swung her elbow upward, driving it directly into his chest, hitting him with enough power to make him stumble back, his breath leaving him in a strangled wheeze as he staggered against the narrate nearest seat. His grip on the bag loosened for only a second, but it was all she needed. She yanked it free, reclaiming it as she straightened herself, her eyes still locked on him, her breathing steady despite the sudden surge of adrenaline coursing through her limbs. Earl coughed, his face momentarily twisted in shock, his hand pressing against the spot where she had struck him, his mouth opening and closing, as if struggling to reconcile what had just happened. as if trying to process the fact that he had just been bested by the very woman he had assumed would crumble under his touch. His pride, already wounded, was now fully shattered, and in the thick silence that followed, it became clear to everyone on that bus that he was not going to let it go. A hushed murmur passed through the rows of passengers, some of whom were now watching more intently, others who were pretending to scroll through their phones but were sneaking glances between screens. The undeniable shift in the atmosphere making them aware that this was no longer just an argument, no longer just a drunken outburst that could be ignored until it went away. A young woman seated near the back discreetly lifted her phone, her camera angled toward the front, capturing the moment in grainy footage that would later be shared, analyzed, debated. The bus driver exhaled loudly from his seat, one hand gripping the steering wheel while the other rested lazily against the gear shift, his shoulders rising and falling with exaggerated annoyance, as if he had just about had enough of this disturbance, but had no intention of stepping in to put an end to it. His voice, dry and indifferent, barely carried over the thick tension suffocating the space. "Would you both just sit down already?" There was no authority in his words, no real attempt at control, no genuine concern for the fact that a man had just attempted to rip a bag from an elderly woman's hands, no acknowledgement that this had gone far beyond a simple dispute. He wanted them to sit down, not because he cared about what was happening, not because he wanted to keep anyone safe, but because he wanted the noise to stop, because he wanted to finish his shift without having to file a report, because it was easier to pretend that this was nothing than to admit that he had allowed it to escalate. A man seated near the front, dressed in a stiff business suit, exhaled through his nose and shook his head slightly, his hand lifting to rub at his temple before muttering, more to himself than anyone else, "This is getting out of hand." A woman clutching a worn leather purse let out a quiet sigh, her fingers adjusting around the strap as she shook her head slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line of disapproval, though whether it was for Earl or for Dolores, no one could quite tell. And then, like a final insult, like a last act of defiance, Earl lunged forward again, but this time not for her bag. His hand shot out toward her shoulder, his movements less calculated now, more reckless, more desperate, more determined to prove something he still had not yet managed to prove. His palm shoved against her arm, harder this time, the force of it tilting her body sideways, the weight of her bag shifting just enough to throw off her balance for only a moment. But it was enough. Her groceries spilled. The bag, already heavy, already strained from the struggle, tilted at the wrong angle, the strap slipping against her fingers as its contents tumbled to the floor, rolling in different directions, scattering across the rubber mat. A can of beans hit the side of a seat with a dull thud. A loaf of bread landed near a pair of polished dress shoes. A carton of eggs cracked against the floor, the sticky yellow yolk spreading out in uneven puddles that no one made any attempt to avoid. A few passengers groaned audibly, some lifting their feet, others muttering beneath their breath about the inconvenience, about the mess, about how unnecessary all of this had become. Earl let out a breathy chuckle, his lips curling upward, his arms lifting slightly in exaggerated mock innocence. "Oops!" Dolores did not look at him. She did not turn her gaze toward the passengers who were shifting in their seats, nor did she glance toward the driver who had still not lifted a single hand to stop what was happening. Instead, she stared at the mess, at the small but significant evidence of yet another thing he had taken from her simply because he could, simply because no one had stopped him, simply because the world had long allowed men like him to take without consequences. The bus rolled forward, the moment hanging in the air, the tension so thick it was nearly suffocating. But despite the weight of it, despite the way every eye was now drawn toward her, despite the way Earl was still grinning as if he had won something, she did not react in the way he expected her to. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate breath. The kind of breath that signaled a choice had been made, a decision had been finalized, A boundary had been drawn that would not be crossed again. The sticky yolk from the broken eggs spread across the rubber mat, pooling beneath Dolores's feet, seeping into the worn grooves of the floor where dirt had settled, where the remnants of countless forgotten spills had been absorbed into the fabric of the bus itself. A can of beans, its label partially torn from the impact, rolled lazily beneath a seat, while a bruised apple had come to rest near the foot of a man in a stiff business suit, though he made no effort to retrieve it. Instead, he merely sighed, shifting his leg inward as if offended by the mere presence of the fallen fruit. Dolores bent down slowly, her joints protesting the movement, her body feeling the weight of the moment as she reached for what little she could salvage. Her fingers closed around the can of soup first, the cold metal pressing against her palm, grounding her in the present, reminding her that she had not imagined any of this, that every second of this humiliation was real, that every moment of degradation was unfolding before the eyes of strangers who had chosen to remain silent. She knew what they saw when they looked at her now, not a woman who had been harassed, not someone who had been forced into this position, not someone who had been wronged, but merely a woman who had allowed herself to become part of the spectacle. A woman who should have just let things go before they reached this point. A woman who should have known better than to resist what had always been inevitable. She reached for the loaf of bread next, its plastic wrapping torn slightly, the once pristine shape of it now slightly crushed. No longer as fresh as it had been when she had first stepped onto the bus. A sharp, wheezing chuckle rang out above her, the sound grating, filled with mocking satisfaction, followed by the slow, slurred drawl of Earl Pritchard's voice, thick with liquor and venom, settling over her like something rancid, something she could not avoid no matter how much she tried to ignore it. "Well, now look at that," he muttered, his tone dripping with amusement as he watched her collect the remains of what had once been whole. "Down on your knees, picking up scraps. Ain't that just something to see? 'Bout time you figured out where you belong." His words, sharp and deliberate, cut through the already thick air, landing with purpose, twisting the moment into something worse, something crueler, something designed to be heard not just by her, but by everyone who had sat in silence, by everyone who had chosen to turn their heads and pretend this was not their concern. A few of the passengers shifted in their seats, some visibly uncomfortable now, their expressions wavering between unease and disinterest. Though still, none of them said anything. No one told him to stop. No one told him that enough was enough. No one stood up, not even now, when it was clear that this had never been an argument, never been just a dispute between two people. Dolores felt their stares, not with pity, not with sympathy, but with judgment, with quiet disapproval that was not directed at the man who had done this to her, but at her for allowing it to escalate, at her for not having done what she was supposed to do from the beginning, at her for not having known better. A man near the front, his expression drawn in irritation, let out a tired sigh, rubbing his temple before muttering something under his breath, more to himself than anyone else, though loud enough for those nearest to him to hear. She could have just sat somewhere else. This all could have been avoided. A woman, gripping the strap of her purse tightly, nodded slightly in agreement, though she said nothing. A younger passenger, barely looking up from her phone, rolled her eyes before turning back to her screen, the weight of her disinterest louder than any words she could have spoken. Earl, watching all of this unfold, watching the way no one had stopped him, watching the way their silence continued to excuse his behavior, allowed a slow grin to spread across his face as he took a step closer, his body swaying slightly from the alcohol, but his presence still imposing, still looming, still pressing down on her with the weight of entitlement he had carried all his life. "You sit there acting like you better than everybody else," he sneered, his words no longer slurred, no longer the careless ramblings of a drunk, but the calculated, deliberate insults of a man who wanted to make sure they landed exactly as intended. But you ain't nothing but a stubborn old woman making a fool of yourself. You think just 'cause you sit up front, that makes you special? You think that means you got the right to talk to me like I ain't the one who's supposed to be sitting here instead of you? His voice dropped lower, leaning in just enough to make sure she felt every word. Ain't nobody on this bus looking at you with respect. They just waiting for you to sit down and shut up. Same as me. Dolores inhaled slowly, steadying herself, feeling the heat rising in her chest, feeling the slow, deliberate weight of all the moments leading up to this one pressing down on her. She had endured the taunts, had held her silence, had taken the insults, the shoves, the passive judgment of the people around her, but there was something about the way he was looking at her now, something about the way his face twisted with smug satisfaction, something about the way he spoke to her as if she were already defeated that made her move. She did not think. She did not hesitate. She did not allow herself to consider what the passengers would say, did not allow herself to fear what the consequences might be, did not allow herself to shrink beneath the weight of what she had been told to endure. Her arm moved, her hand pressing against his chest, not in violence, not in anger, but in force, in finality, in a demand for space that he had refused to give. Earl stumbled slightly, his body shifting with the motion, though he did not fall, did not collapse, did not lose his balance entirely. But it did not matter, because the moment the movement happened, the moment the physical line had been crossed, the collective reaction was immediate. A sharp, audible gasp spread through the bus. The sound of it sharp, the response immediate, as if they had been waiting for this, as if they had been waiting for the moment where they could finally decide who to blame. Earl's mouth curled, his teeth flashing as his chest swelled with triumph. And then, before he could say another word, before he could twist the moment into something worse, before he could claim his victory, the driver's voice cut through the air, sharp and decisive in a way it had never been before. That's it. Dolores turned her head slightly, her pulse still hammering, her breath still slow and controlled, though she knew before she even looked that the words were not meant for him. The driver's gaze was locked onto her. I'm not dealing with this mess. You both, off the bus. Now. Earl's smirk widened, his body shifting slightly as he took a small step back, his hands lifting in a mocking display of innocence, as if this had all been inevitable, as if this had all been leading to this moment where she would be the one forced to leave. Dolores blinked once, her fingers tightening around the remains of her bag, the reality of the moment settling over her in a familiar, unwelcome way. She knew better than to argue. She knew how this ended. Adjusting the strap of her bag, she stepped forward, her posture unshaken, her dignity intact, despite everything that had been taken from her. And as Earl followed behind her, as the doors shut with finality, as the bus pulled away and the city swallowed them whole, she knew that whatever came next, this was far from over. The thick heat of the afternoon wrapped around Dolores as she stepped off the bus, the weight of the encounter still lingering in her bones, pressing against her ribs, coiling in the base of her spine. The bus doors hissed shut behind her, its engine groaning as it pulled away from the curb, carrying its silence, its indifference, its quiet judgment away with it. The moment should have ended there. The story should have been closed, left behind in the dust kicked up by the tires as the city swallowed it whole. But Dolores knew better than to believe that was the case. She took a steadying breath, adjusting the strap of her bag, her fingers still curled around the salvaged remains of her groceries, her mind already shifting forward, already pushing past what had happened, already preparing to move on. But even as she took her first step down the sidewalk, she felt it. The presence behind her. The weight of something unfinished. Something unwilling to be left behind. Something dragging itself after her with the same persistence as a shadow at her heels. The uneven shuffle of boots dragged against the pavement, slower than her own steps, but intentional, relentless, unwilling to let go, carrying with them the unmistakable energy of a man who had decided he was owed something. She did not turn. She kept walking, but the voice came anyway, sharp, bitter, laced with the same festering resentment that had been bubbling up since the moment she had refused to shrink for him. "You think this is over?" Earl's words hit the air, thick with the sour stink of whiskey and self-importance, his breath heavy, his tone ragged from the shouting he had done on the bus, but still carrying the same venom, the same bile, the same wounded pride that refused to let him stop. Dolores's steps remained steady, her posture unwavering, but she could hear the way his boots scuffed harder against the ground, the uncoordinated lurch of a man too drunk to move right, but too angry to stop himself. "I ain't done with you," he muttered, his words cutting through the summer heat like the blade of a dull knife, jagged and unclean, a mess of slurred syllables fueled by indignation. She still didn't react. She still didn't turn, but that only made him angrier. "You just gonna keep walking like I ain't talking to you?" His voice climbed, gaining an edge, growing bolder, swelling with the kind of entitlement that made men like him dangerous, as if the lack of an audience had given him permission to be worse, to say the things he hadn't dared to say, back on the bus, the things he had been waiting to let out. "I don't care how old you are," he spat, the words dripping with condescension, sharp and deliberate, the intent behind them just as pointed as the insult itself. "You don't get to do what you did and think you can just walk away. You don't get to run that mouth and then act like I don't exist. You hear me?" A couple of pedestrians slowed slightly as they passed, their eyes flickering toward the scene, their expressions ranging from hesitant concern to mild disinterest. But no one stopped. No one ever stopped. Dolores kept her breath even, kept her grip on her bag firm, kept her pace measured, the tension in her shoulders the only indication that she was feeling the weight of it all, that she had spent a lifetime navigating moments like these, and still, after all these years, she had not yet been given the privilege of walking away without being followed. Earl was still talking, still filling the space between them with his drunken nonsense, still reaching for something, anything, that would provoke her into turning around. He was unraveling now, pushing harder, searching for the wound he could exploit, the weak spot he could sink his teeth into. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" His words turned uglier, more vicious, twisting with the desperation of a man who had never learned how to walk away from a fight he wasn't winning. "Think you got the right to sit where you want, act how you want, talk how you want, like you ain't got no damn consequences." She heard his footsteps quicken, the space between them closing, the heat of his presence inching closer, the electricity of his temper thickening in the air around her. "Look at me when I'm talking to you." She felt it before it happened. The shift in the air, the desperation in his movements, the reckless anger spilling over, feeding into his actions without thought or control. Then his hand clamped down on her shoulder. The grip was rough, not enough to truly hurt her, not enough to bruise, but enough to demand something from her, to try to force her to turn, to make her look at him, to make her acknowledge him, to make her engage in the moment he had been clawing toward since the beginning. And Dolores had had enough. Without hesitation, without warning, without giving him another second to think he had control over this moment, she moved with the kind of precision that had been honed through years of knowing exactly when to strike. Her hand shot up fast, her palm cutting through the thick summer air before it collided with the side of his face. The sound of the slap cracked through the space between them, sharp, undeniable, final, carrying with it all the weight of every moment before it, every insult, every humiliation, every time he had overstepped, every inch of space he had tried to take that was never his to claim. Earl stumbled, his boots scuffing against the concrete, his balance thrown, his body lurching sideways as his head snapped in the direction of the blow. His breath caught, his hand instinctively flying to his cheek, his fingers pressing against the sting, his entire body reeling from the reality of what had just happened. For the first time since this all began, he was silent. Pedestrians, previously walking past without care, had stopped, their eyes locked onto the unfolding scene, their faces frozen in a mixture of shock and something else, something close to awe. Conversations had stalled, moments had been put on pause, and now, for the first time, people were paying attention. A woman near the curb reached for her phone, her fingers moving quickly, the soft click of a screen unlocking barely audible over the quiet murmur of those watching. A man standing near a shop entrance exhaled sharply, his head shaking as he muttered, "Somebody call the cops." Earl's breath came in ragged bursts, his shoulders rising and falling, his fingers twitching slightly, his mind still struggling to catch up with the humiliation seeping into his skin, still trying to make sense of the fact that he had just been put in his place by the very woman he had been so sure he could break. But Dolores did not give him time to recover. She did not wait for him to sputter out whatever pathetic excuse for rage still clung to his pride. She turned, and she walked away. Her steps remained measured, her breath even, her posture unshaken, as if this moment had already left her mind, as if she had already moved on, as if he was no longer worth her time. Behind her, Earl finally found his voice again, but it was nothing more than a choked, incoherent mess of slurred curses and pitiful rage, words that had no meaning, no weight, no real direction, the last, desperate cries of a man who had already lost. She had given him a chance to walk away, and he had refused. Now, whatever happened next, that was his problem, not hers. The video spread faster than wildfire, first through the hands of a few onlookers, then onto social media, where it took on a life of its own. The footage, grainy but unmistakably clear in its impact, captured every moment. From the verbal assault on the bus, to Earl grabbing Dolores's shoulder, to the sharp, resounding slap that sent him stumbling. The internet wasted no time in picking apart every frame, dissecting the confrontation from every possible angle, shaping it into something larger than just a moment between two people on a street corner. Within hours, the video was everywhere. Clips played on the evening news, headlines flashed across websites, and comment sections turned into battlegrounds of opinion, with some hailing Dolores as a symbol of resilience, while others questioned why she had dared to fight back at all. Elderly black woman defends herself against racist attack on city bus. Justice or escalation? Should she have walked away? Internet divided over viral confrontation. Bus company releases statement after shocking incident goes public. The conversation had spiraled beyond her control, beyond anything Dolores had ever imagined, beyond the quiet anger and exhaustion she had carried with her for so long. Her name was now a hashtag, her face frozen mid-slap in the still images that accompanied articles and debates. Her story retold in 1,000 different ways, each version shaped by the lens of the person telling it. Some saw her as a hero, a woman who had endured and finally drawn a line in the sand, refusing to be a silent victim, refusing to bow to the same old violence, refusing to let yet another man think he could do whatever he pleased without consequence. Others saw her as reckless, aggressive, at fault for escalating a situation that to them should have ended with silence, should have been ignored, should have been endured. She should have just walked away. She didn't need to slap him. There were other ways to handle it. She knew what she was doing. The words piled onto her, not in whispers but in shouts, in bold text, in fiery debates between strangers who had never lived a day in her shoes, but were so certain of how she should have reacted, so certain of what she should have done. Meanwhile, the bus company, desperate to distance itself from the controversy, wasted no time in issuing a statement, a cold, corporate attempt to extinguish the fire before it burned them too deeply. We do not tolerate racism or violence of any kind on our buses. The safety and comfort of our passengers are our top priorities. We are reviewing the incident and cooperating fully with authorities." The words were empty, carefully constructed to sound strong while meaning nothing, designed to give the appearance of action without admitting fault. They did not acknowledge that the driver had ignored what was happening, did not acknowledge that Dolores had been kicked off the bus alongside the man who had harassed her, did not acknowledge that this had been allowed to happen in front of a bus full of silent witnesses. They wanted the public to forget. They wanted the moment to fade, for the noise to die down, for the world to move on before anyone could look too closely at the cracks in their system, before anyone could ask why Dolores had been punished for defending herself while her attacker had been given the same treatment, as if they were equal in fault. But the world was not so quick to forget. Protests began to stir in the corners of the city, small gatherings at first, then growing larger as more voices joined in. Signs were held high, demands were made, questions were raised that the bus company could no longer ignore. Why was she blamed? Why was she told to leave when she had done nothing wrong? Why does this keep happening? The pressure mounted, and the company scrambled to find footing, balancing between public condemnation and their own unwillingness to accept responsibility. They insisted they would look into the incident, but refused to say what that meant. They claimed they had a commitment to inclusivity, but took no action beyond vague promises. And through it all, Dolores watched, her name rising and falling in the tides of public opinion, her story no longer just hers, but something else now. Something bigger than she had ever meant for it to be. She had not asked for this. She had only wanted to get home. Now, the world had its eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do next. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was not finished yet. Dolores had seen her share of battles in her lifetime, but she had never expected one to come knocking at her door in the form of a young man in a pressed navy blue suit, standing on her front porch with purpose in his stance and fire in his eyes. The last few days had been overwhelming, an avalanche of attention she had never asked for, her phone ringing from sunrise to midnight with numbers she didn't recognize, reporters leaving messages, activists reaching out, strangers offering both support and condemnation in equal measure. The video had taken on a life of its own, stretching far beyond her control, turning what had simply been a fight for her dignity into something that belonged to the public now, something larger than just that one afternoon on the bus. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had fought back in that moment for herself, not for the headlines, not for the movements that now chanted her name. And yet, it was impossible to ignore the way the world had latched onto what had happened to her. A young woman from the community had knocked on her door 2 nights ago, handing her a folded piece of paper with a list of names, people who had offered to support her, who wanted to rally, who wanted to do something. Dolores had thanked her politely, placed the paper on the kitchen table and let it sit there, untouched, as she tried to convince herself that she wasn't responsible for what came next. But every time she walked past that table, every time she heard her phone buzz with another message, every time she turned on the television and saw her own face staring back at her, she felt the undeniable weight of it all pressing against her ribs. This was no longer just about her, and that truth made her uneasy. She hadn't answered the door for anyone before today, but something about the way this young man stood, patient yet unshaken, hands clasped in front of him as if he had all the time in the world, made her finally sigh, unlock the door, and pull it open. "You must be Miss Whitaker," he said, his voice smooth, professional, carrying the weight of a man who had spent years learning how to make people listen when he spoke. "My name is Jamal Hawkins. I'm a civil rights attorney." Dolores studied him for a long moment, eyes narrowing slightly as she took him in. His sharp gaze, the neatness of his appearance, the confidence he wore like second skin. "You one of those TV lawyers?" she asked, arching an eyebrow, because she had seen enough of them these past few days, loud men in expensive suits who just wanted to sink their teeth into the next big headline, looking to use her name for their own gain. Jamal smiled, not the arrogant, self-serving kind she had grown used to seeing, but something more knowing, something more patient. "I don't care much for TV," he said simply, "but I do care about justice." Dolores gave a slow nod, her fingers still gripping the doorframe, her expression unreadable as she glanced him over one more time. "And what is it you want from me, Mr. Hawkins?" He shifted slightly, his hands still clasped, his tone measured, careful. "I want to help you fight back." She let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head. "Ain't that what I already did?" Jamal's smile didn't falter, but his expression grew more serious, his voice lowering just enough to draw her in. "You fought back in the moment, and you were right to. But now, we have to fight back where it really matters. In the courts." Dolores exhaled through her nose, her gaze slipping past him for a brief moment, settling on the quiet street beyond, the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders once again. "You've been watching that video, haven't you?" she muttered. "Everyone has," Jamal admitted. "But the difference is, I see more than just the moment itself. I see what it represents." Dolores gave a slow nod, not saying anything for a long moment, just watching him, weighing him, trying to decide if this was a road she was ready to go down. Jamal took the silence as permission to continue. "This is bigger than just you, Miss Whitaker," he said, his voice firm, steady. "This is about every person who's been told to sit down, to be quiet, to let things go. It's about every black woman who's been disrespected and expected to endure it. It's about every company that allows things like this to happen and refuses to take responsibility. And it's about making sure that this isn't just another story that people argue about online for a week before they move on to the next thing." Dolores let out a slow breath, her fingers tapping lightly against the doorframe. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Jamal straightened slightly, his stance solid, unwavering. "We sue both Earl Pritchard and the bus company." At that, Dolores let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "That man ain't got 2 pennies to rub together. What good's it gonna do me to sue him?" Jamal's expression didn't change. "It's not about the money. It's about accountability. We file a civil suit against him for harassment and assault. Even if he doesn't have anything to take, we make sure he's held responsible for what he did. And the bus company?" He tilted his head slightly. "That's the real fight. They let this happen. Their driver let this happen. And instead of standing by you, they threw you off that bus, like you were the problem. They don't get to just put out a half-hearted statement and walk away." Dolores let his words settle, feeling the weight of them in her chest, the truth of them sitting heavy and immovable. "You really think we can win?" she asked finally. Jamal's lips pressed together in thought, but there was no hesitation when he answered. "I think we can make them listen." And that was enough. She took one last deep breath, exhaled slowly, then nodded. "All right, Mr. Hawkins, let's do it." Jamal's smile returned, not one of celebration, but one of quiet understanding. "Then let's get started." The fallout from the video was swift, relentless, and far beyond anything Earl Pritchard had expected. For a man who had spent his life getting away with behavior that had always been dismissed, excused, or outright ignored, the sudden scrutiny was suffocating in a way he had never experienced before. The world had finally decided to pay attention. And Earl, who had always believed he could say and do whatever he pleased without consequence, was now realizing, too late, that consequences had arrived, and there was no escaping them. At first, he had brushed it off. The morning after the confrontation, hungover and bitter, he had turned on the news, only to see his own face plastered across the screen. Frozen mid-stumble after Dolores's slap had sent him reeling. The reporters spoke in measured tones, careful but damning, outlining the details of the incident, highlighting his words, his actions, and his history. His name was everywhere, spreading across social media, becoming the subject of late-night talk shows, dissected, debated, and picked apart by people he had never met, but who now hated him with a passion that burned hotter than the liquor still lingering in his bloodstream. Still, he had convinced himself it would blow over. People got mad about things all the time. They ranted online, wrote angry posts, and pretended to care for a few days before they moved on to the next thing. That was how it had always worked. That was how it should have worked. But this time, they didn't move on. And then he lost his job. The phone call came from his boss, a man who had known Earl for over a decade, a man who had laughed at his off-color jokes in the break room, who had never seemed to mind his sharp tongue or his opinions. Until now. Earl, the man sighed on the other end of the line, his tone laced with the kind of forced regret that let Earl know he was already done for. "We can't keep you on. Not after this." Earl scoffed, gripping the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white as he leaned forward in his chair. "Oh, so now you got a problem with me? You knew who I was before all this nonsense started. I ain't changed." His boss hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to argue, as if he wanted to find a way to make it seem like this wasn't personal, like this was just an unfortunate situation that no one had control over. But in the end, he didn't bother with excuses. "That's exactly the issue," he muttered, his voice quieter now, as if he was embarrassed to even be having this conversation. "This isn't just some misunderstanding, Earl. The whole damn world's seen that video. They're calling, they're emailing, they're showing up at the office demanding we fire you." Earl let out a sharp, bitter laugh, but there was no real humor in it. "So what? Let 'em be mad. They'll forget about it by next week. Just wait it out." His boss exhaled, the sound heavy and final in a way that made Earl's stomach twist. "They won't forget, Earl. And even if they did, this isn't your first time." And that was when the real panic set in, because Earl knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't just about the video anymore. The past had come crawling back, dragging with it everything he had buried, everything people had let slide, everything no one had cared enough to hold him accountable for, until now. Within hours of the slap going viral, old complaints had surfaced, stories people had buried, incidents people had overlooked because, at the time, they hadn't mattered enough to anyone in power. But now, they did. Former co-workers spoke up, recalling the racist comments he had made in the office, the crude jokes that had always been dismissed as just Earl being Earl. His neighbors shared their experiences, detailing the times he had spat slurs at them from his front porch, the nights he had come home drunk, and yelling about his country being taken from him, the sneers, the passive-aggressive hostility, the outright threats that no one had ever done anything about. People who had once laughed off his behavior, who had brushed aside his cruelty, who had waved away his drunken tirades as nothing more than a harmless old fool talking, were suddenly pretending they had never known what kind of man he really was. Someone had dug up an HR report from 15 years ago, detailing a pattern of harassment and bigoted remarks toward a black employee who had left the company soon after. It had never amounted to anything back then, swept under the rug, dismissed as minor workplace tension. But now, it was evidence. Now, it was fuel. And then came the final blow. His son, the last person Earl had expected to turn against him, stepped forward, not to defend his father, but to denounce him publicly in a statement that spread just as quickly as the video had. A news anchor read it aloud on air, her voice steady, neutral, but the words sliced through whatever thread of dignity Earl still had left, stripping him bare for the world to see. "My name is Ryan Pritchard, and I want to make it clear that I do not condone my father's words or actions. This is not the first time he has displayed such behavior, but I truly hope it is the last. I have spent my life ashamed of his racism, and I refuse to be silent now that the world is finally seeing him for who he really is." Earl couldn't believe it. His own son, his own flesh and blood, throwing him to the wolves. For all the anger, for all the resentment he could stomach, that was the one thing that truly knocked the wind out of him, that forced him to sit down and face the reality that no amount of shouting or drunken self-pity would change. His hands trembled as he turned off the TV, his throat dry, his stomach knotted. No phone calls from friends, no support from his neighbors, no way to fight back. For the first time in his life, no one was making excuses for him. And as the headlines continued rolling in, as his name became a stain in history instead of just another man people tolerated, he felt it settle in his chest. The cold, suffocating truth that had never occurred to him before. The world had finally decided he wasn't worth saving. And Earl, sitting alone in the wreckage of his own making, realized he had nowhere left to go. The meeting was set in a high-rise conference room overlooking the city, the kind of place designed to make people feel small, to remind them of their place, to make them forget what they came for and settle for what they were given. Dolores had seen these tactics before. The grandness of the setting, the carefully orchestrated hospitality, the unspoken pressure to take what was offered before it was too late. But she was not a woman easily swayed. She sat at the polished mahogany table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable as the representatives from the bus company filed in. They were exactly as she had expected. Smiling, practiced, dressed in expensive suits that reeked of corporate detachment. Jamal Hawkins sat beside her, his posture relaxed but sharp, his dark suit crisp, his pen tapping lightly against his notepad. A quiet warning that he was listening to every single word. Across from them, a man with a salt-and-pepper beard and a name tag that read Michael Langley, Senior Legal Counsel, took his seat, followed by a younger woman in a navy pantsuit, her expression carefully neutral as she smoothed out a folder in front of her. Langley cleared his throat, offering Dolores a tight-lipped smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Miss Whitaker," he began, his voice warm in a way that felt entirely manufactured. "We understand that recent events have been difficult for you. I want to start by saying that the company deeply regrets the situation that occurred on our bus. It was never our intention for you to feel disrespected or unsafe." Dolores arched an eyebrow but said nothing. Jamal leaned forward slightly, tilting his head. "She didn't feel disrespected," he said, his tone casual but pointed. "She was disrespected. She was harassed, and your company allowed it to happen." Langley let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if Jamal was being unreasonable, as if these were just minor details, as if they were all here to be civil. "We acknowledge that the incident was unfortunate," Langley continued. "That's why we want to resolve this matter quickly and amicably. We understand that Miss Whitaker has suffered undue stress, and we'd like to offer a financial settlement to compensate for any distress this situation has caused." He reached into his folder and slid a neatly printed document across the table toward them, a single sheet that carried far more weight than its thin frame suggested. Dolores didn't move to pick it up. Jamal, however, did. His eyes scanned the paper briefly before he let out a slow exhale through his nose, shaking his head as he placed it back onto the table, tapping his fingers against it once before pushing it toward Dolores, offering her a silent chance to look at it herself. She did, and her lips curled into something between amusement and disappointment. "This all you got?" she asked, lifting her gaze to Langley. "That's what you think my dignity is worth?" Langley's expression remained even, but Dolores saw the flicker of annoyance beneath his carefully controlled features, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers pressed a little too firmly against the table. "It's a generous offer," the woman beside him interjected, speaking for the first time. "Many would consider it fair." Jamal let out a low chuckle, rubbing his chin. "Fair for who?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Your company? The people who let this happen? The ones who threw her off the bus like she was the problem?" Langley exhaled sharply, straightening his posture. "Look," he said, voice still polite, but now with an edge of finality. "This case has drawn a lot of attention. We're offering this as a gesture of goodwill, to put this behind us and move forward." Dolores folded her hands over the document, her fingers smoothing out the paper before she calmly pushed it back toward them. "I ain't interested in moving forward," she said, her voice steady, her eyes locking onto Langley's without a hint of hesitation. Not without real change. Langley blinked, his polite mask slipping for just a fraction of a second, before he let out a short, strained laugh. "Miss Whitaker, I understand that this is emotional for you, but..." Jamal's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. "Watch your words," he warned, his tone sharp enough to slice through the air. "She's not being emotional. She's being reasonable. The only ones emotional here are the people scrambling to save their reputations because they got caught." Langley let out a slow breath through his nose, visibly reining in his frustration before glancing back at Dolores. "What exactly is it that you want?" Dolores leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table as she met his gaze head-on. "I want a real policy in place," she said. "I want every driver trained to step in when something like this happens. I want a clear rule that protects passengers from being harassed. And I want it enforced. Not just words on a paper, not just some 'we do not tolerate racism' nonsense on your website. I want action. I want accountability. I want this to mean something." Langley's jaw tightened, his fingers lacing together as he weighed his response carefully. "That's a complicated request," he said finally. "No," Dolores countered. "It's a simple one." Jamal nodded, turning his attention back to Langley. "Your company has already made a statement claiming you do not tolerate racism," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "If that's true, then it shouldn't be difficult to back those words up with action. Or would you rather let this case go to court, where we can discuss, at length, why your driver did nothing, why Miss Whitaker was treated like an equal problem instead of a victim, why this wasn't the first time a situation like this was ignored?" Langley's lips pressed into a thin line. The woman beside him shifted slightly in her seat, clearly aware of the weight of what Jamal was saying, clearly uncomfortable with the reality of what would happen if this case went public in a courtroom, instead of being swept under the rug with a neatly printed settlement agreement. "We'll need time to discuss this internally," Langley said, after a long pause, his voice measured, but no longer carrying the same smug confidence it had when the meeting started. Dolores nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Take all the time you need," she said. "I've waited this long. I can wait a little longer." With that, she rose from her seat, her movements calm, composed, the energy in the room shifting entirely in her favor. Jamal followed suit, straightening his tie as he tucked his notebook under his arm. "We'll be expecting a real offer next time," he said, glancing between Langley and his associate. "And if we don't get one, we'll see you in court." Langley didn't respond, because for the first time he wasn't sure they were bluffing. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension, the weight of expectation pressing down on every person seated in the gallery. Civil rights activists filled the benches, their faces set in quiet determination, their presence a statement in itself. Reporters lined the back, cameras clicking as they documented what had quickly become one of the most talked-about trials in recent memory. Supporters had shown up in droves, people who had seen the video, people who had lived through similar experiences, people who had been waiting for justice in one form or another. Dolores sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight, her hands resting on the polished wood in front of her, her face calm but unshaken. She had faced worse than this. She had survived worse than this. And today, she would make sure her voice was heard, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told to endure, to stay silent, to let things go. Beside her, Jamal Hawkins adjusted his tie, his expression unreadable, his fingers lightly tapping against his notepad as he watched the opposing side take their seats. He had come prepared, and it showed in the sharpness of his gaze, in the way his shoulders squared, in the way he had already won half the battle before it had even begun. Across the room, Earl Pritchard slumped in his chair, his face a mess of bruised pride and resentment. His clothes, which once might have carried an air of arrogance, now hung off him like a poor attempt at respectability. His usual bluster had been forced into something tighter, something controlled, but the bitterness still burned beneath the surface. The judge, An older black woman with an air of authority that left no room for foolishness glanced over the room before turning her attention to the defense. "Mr. Pritchard, you may begin." Earl's attorney, Michael Langley, a balding man with a stiff posture and the look of someone who knew this was a losing battle but had no choice but to fight it anyway, rose from his seat and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth, practiced, but lacking conviction. "What happened that day on the bus was nothing short of a misunderstanding that has since spiraled into an unfair attack on my client's reputation." A low murmur rippled through the gallery, but the judge raised a hand, silencing it. Earl straightened slightly, as if emboldened by the words, as if they gave him the confidence to return to the role he had always played best, the victim. "I was attacked," he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom with the same entitlement that had defined him his entire life. "I was minding my own business, and then, out of nowhere, this woman put her hands on me." Jamal barely blinked, his expression betraying nothing as he listened. Earl continued, his voice thick with self-pity, as if he truly believed what he was saying, as if he had convinced himself that the story had happened exactly as he was now describing it. "I was humiliated," he said, shaking his head as if the memory pained him. "I lost my job. My son turned against me. All because I was the one who got attacked on that street." Langley gave him a small nod, a subtle encouragement to keep playing the victim. "And when you say attacked, Mr. Pritchard," Langley prompted, "you mean she hit me?" Earl snapped. "For no reason. I was just standing there, and she slapped you," Langley clarified. "Yes." Earl's voice rose slightly, a flash of indignation coloring his face red. "She just, out of nowhere, smacked me like I was some kind of criminal." Jamal leaned forward at that, a flicker of something sharp glinting behind his composed demeanor. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, but carrying just enough weight to shift the air in the room, to reclaim the moment before Earl could shape it into something false. The judge nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Hawkins." Jamal turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the jury, letting the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel it. Then he pressed play. The courtroom fell into absolute stillness as the footage from the bus played on the screen before them, every moment captured in crisp, unforgiving detail. Earl's voice rang out first, slurred but clear, the venom in his words cutting through the air just as sharply now as they had in the moment. "You don't belong up here. Get to the back where you're supposed to be. Ain't nobody want to look at you sitting up front." The room was silent, so silent that even the sound of people shifting in their seats was noticeable. The video continued. It showed everything. The way he loomed over Dolores, the way he shoved her bag, the way he reached for her shoulder, the way his fingers dug into her skin before she ever laid a hand on him. Then the slap, a sharp, undeniable crack of justice that didn't just land on Earl Pritchard's face that day, it landed on history itself. When the video ended, the silence remained. For a long moment, no one spoke. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Jamal turned back to Earl, his expression neutral, but his eyes carrying the weight of the truth. "You say you were attacked, Mr. Pritchard?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Would you like to explain to the court how exactly that fits with what we just watched?" Earl's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his fingers curling slightly on the table, his face growing red beneath the weight of reality. Langley shifted, but before he could interject, Earl blurted out, "That video don't show everything." Jamal's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh, what exactly does it leave out?" Earl huffed, his frustration bubbling over. "I was just talking. I didn't mean nothing by it. People say things all the time. It ain't like I hit her." Jamal tilted his head slightly. "You mean, aside from grabbing her, blocking her path, and shoving her belongings?" Earl's jaw clenched. "I was drunk. I wasn't thinking straight." Jamal nodded slowly, as if considering this. "So, just to clarify, you're saying that because you were drunk, You shouldn't be held accountable for your actions? Earl opened his mouth to respond, but the murmurs in the crowd were growing louder. The jury was watching him, watching his excuses unravel in real time. Jamal let the moment breathe before delivering the final blow. You claim that you were the victim, he said, turning toward the jury. But what we just saw tells an entirely different story. We saw you harassing a woman who did nothing to provoke you. We saw you escalate the situation, shoving her belongings, raising your voice, refusing to let her leave in peace. We saw you grab her, putting your hands on her without consent. His voice did not rise, did not waver, and yet the power in it was unmistakable. "Mr. Pritchard," Jamal said, his tone sharp as a blade. "Do you know what that's called?" Earl remained silent, his face twisted with impotent rage. Jamal nodded once. "It's called assault." The weight of the word settled into the room like a stone. Unshakable, immovable, absolute. And for the first time, Earl Pritchard had nothing left to say. The courtroom had already been tense, but when the bailiff called the next witness, the atmosphere shifted entirely. There was a rustling of whispers, a low murmur of speculation, heads turning toward the doors as they opened, and the next witness stepped forward. Ryan Pritchard, Earl's son. The moment he entered, Earl stiffened, his jaw clenching so tightly that the tendons in his neck stood out like steel cables. He hadn't seen his son in weeks, not since Ryan's statement had gone public, not since the boy had turned his back on him in front of the whole world. But now, there he was, walking toward the stand with a purpose that sent a ripple of unease through Earl's entire body. Ryan wasn't like his father. He had never been. Where Earl had spent his life marinating in bitterness, Ryan had spent his carving his own path, distancing himself from the weight of his father's legacy. His suit was neatly pressed, his expression composed but not indifferent, his movements calm but firm. As he sat in the witness chair and raised his right hand, swearing to tell the truth, Earl gripped the table in front of him so tightly his knuckles turned white. Jamal Hawkins wasted no time. He rose from his seat, buttoned his jacket with a precise movement, and stepped forward, his hands folded neatly in front of him. "Mr. Pritchard," he began, his voice even, giving Ryan the space to settle into the moment. "You understand that your testimony today will be entered into official record, correct?" "Yes, sir," Ryan answered, his tone measured. "You also understand that your father is the defendant in this case?" A flicker of something passed across Ryan's face, but it wasn't hesitation. It was acceptance. "Yes, I do." Earl's fists clenched, but he didn't interrupt. He couldn't. Jamal nodded once, then let the silence settle before delivering the question that everyone had been waiting for. "Mr. Pritchard, do you believe your father is innocent?" Ryan exhaled through his nose, then lifted his gaze, making direct eye contact with Jamal. His voice, steady and unwavering, cut through the silence like a blade. "I've watched my father be a racist my whole life," he said. This time he got caught. The gallery erupted. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by hushed whispers, journalists scribbling furiously, cameras clicking as reporters leaned forward, trying to capture every inch of Ryan's expression. Earl jerked forward in his seat, his face turning a deep shade of red. "What the hell is this?" he barked, his voice rough, but the judge banged her gavel before he could say another word. "Mr. Pritchard," she warned sharply, turning a firm glare in his direction, "you will not speak unless addressed." Earl's mouth snapped shut, his nostrils flaring, his rage boiling over in his eyes. But he had no choice but to sit there and take it. Jamal gave him a fleeting glance before turning his attention back to Ryan. "Can you elaborate on that, Mr. Pritchard?" Ryan gave a slow nod. "My father has always been this way. This isn't new. It didn't start on that bus. He spent his life saying things he shouldn't, treating people like they're beneath him, pushing boundaries because no one ever stopped him. He's had a problem with black people, with immigrants, with anyone who doesn't look like him or think like him for as long as I can remember." Earl shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the table, but he said nothing. For once in his life, he had nothing to say. Jamal nodded, his gaze steady. "Did you ever confront him about it?" Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, before he gave a small, bitter chuckle. "More times than I can count," he admitted. "We fought about it when I was a teenager. We fought about it when I left home. We fought about it every time he opened his mouth and embarrassed himself in public. But he never listened. He never changed, and after a while, I realized that he didn't want to." Jamal let those words settle before continuing. "So when you saw the video of him harassing Miss Whitaker, what was your reaction?" Ryan inhaled deeply, choosing his words carefully, though his expression made it clear that he had been carrying these feelings for a long time. "I wasn't surprised," he admitted, "but I was disgusted." A ripple of murmurs rolled through the courtroom again. Ryan continued before anyone could stop him. "My whole life, I've had to sit in rooms where people assumed I was just like him. People heard my last name and figured I shared his views, figured I laughed at his jokes, figured I believed the same things he did. And for years, I tried to separate myself from him quietly. I tried to distance myself without making a scene." He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "But after I saw that video, I realized that being silent wasn't an option anymore." Jamal gave a small nod of understanding. "Which is why you decided to release your public statement." Ryan nodded. "I had to. Because if I didn't, I was just another person letting him get away with it." At those words, Earl snapped. "You ungrateful little—" The gavel slammed down again, cutting off whatever filth was about to spill from his mouth. "Mr. Pritchard, you are warned a second time. If you speak out again, I will hold you in contempt." Earl forced himself to sink back into his seat, his chest rising and falling with heavy, uneven breaths. But Ryan never looked at him. He didn't acknowledge his father's anger. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. Instead, he turned back to Jamal, waiting for the next question as if nothing had happened. Jamal, ever the professional, gave him a moment to breathe before proceeding. "Mr. Pritchard, in your personal opinion, do you believe your father is remorseful for what happened to Miss Whitaker?" Ryan didn't even hesitate. "No." The word landed in the courtroom like a hammer. Jamal let it hang in the air before finally nodding. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Ryan stepped down from the witness stand, he did not look at his father. And for the first time in his life, Earl Pritchard had no one left in his corner. The courtroom had already seen its fair share of shocking moments, but what came next shifted the case entirely. The focus, which had been aimed squarely at Earl Pritchard, expanded, unraveling something much bigger, something deeper than just one man's hateful outburst. It was about Metro Transit, and how they had been allowing this to happen for years. Jamal Hawkins stood at the front of the courtroom, his suit crisp, his stance steady, his presence commanding the space as he called his next witness. The prosecution calls Detective Alan Reese to the stand. A middle-aged black man in a gray suit stepped forward, his badge clipped to his belt, his expression firm as he moved toward the witness stand. There was an unmistakable authority in his posture, a presence that immediately commanded respect. As he raised his hand and swore to tell the truth, the tension in the room thickened. Jamal approached, hands clasped, his voice smooth but deliberate. "Detective Reese, can you state your occupation for the record?" "I'm a lead investigator with the Civil Rights Division," Reese answered. "And what exactly does that entail?" "My job is to investigate discrimination cases, particularly when there are patterns of racial bias within corporations, law enforcement, or public institutions." Jamal nodded. "And in the course of this case, did you conduct an investigation into the practices of the Metro Transit Bus Company?" "I did." Jamal stepped back slightly, allowing his next question to hang in the air. "And what did you find?" Reese exhaled, his gaze flickering toward the jury, before settling back on Jamal. His voice, steady but weighted, left no room for interpretation. "I found that the Metro Transit Bus Company has a history of ignoring racial harassment and discrimination complaints from both passengers and employees. The courtroom stirred. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Journalists leaning forward, pens scribbling, cameras clicking as the implications settled like a storm rolling in. Jamal let the reaction ride for a moment before continuing. "Detective, can you be more specific?" Reese nodded. Over the last 10 years, at least 14 separate complaints were filed by passengers and employees regarding racist behavior on Metro Transit buses. These complaints involved passengers being harassed by both other riders and, in some cases, by the bus drivers themselves. In every single instance, the company failed to take meaningful action. The judge raised an eyebrow, but she didn't interrupt. She was just as interested as everyone else. Jamal picked up a folder from the table and held it up. "And these complaints, did they include incidents similar to what Miss Whitaker experienced?" "They did." Reese's expression hardened slightly. "We found multiple cases where black passengers reported being harassed, verbally abused, or even physically intimidated by white passengers. In some of these cases, the bus drivers ignored the incidents. In others, the victims were asked to leave the bus rather than the perpetrators." A hushed wave of disgust spread through the crowd. Jamal's voice never wavered. "And how did the bus company respond when these complaints were filed?" "They dismissed most of them outright," Reese said. "In several cases, they claimed there was insufficient evidence to prove misconduct. In others, they failed to follow up at all. Not a single driver involved in these complaints was disciplined, and not a single policy change was made in response." Across the room, Metro Transit's lead attorney, Michael Langley, sat motionless, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the edge of the defense table. His client, the company that had assured him this case was nothing more than a minor controversy, was now on trial in a way they had not anticipated. Jamal turned back toward the jury, his expression calm but resolute. "So just to be clear," he said, "this isn't just about what happened to Miss Whitaker." "No," Reese confirmed. "This is about a pattern of neglect, a pattern of looking the other way, a pattern of allowing incidents like this to continue without accountability." Jamal let the weight of that truth sink in before he approached his next question. "Detective Reese, in your professional opinion, does this suggest that Metro Transit Bus Company has fostered an environment where racism is tolerated?" "Yes." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. The prosecution had just landed a devastating blow. Langley rose to his feet, buttoning his suit jacket as he strode toward the witness stand, his expression carefully composed, though there was a flicker of tension beneath his professional veneer. "Detective Reese," Langley began, his voice smooth, measured, "is it fair to suggest that Metro Transit is solely responsible for the actions of an unruly passenger?" Reese remained calm. "They're responsible for enforcing policies that protect their passengers." Langley nodded, as if considering this before continuing. "But Metro Transit trains its drivers to de-escalate conflicts, does it not? They're not law enforcement. Their priority is keeping the bus moving and ensuring passenger safety, correct?" Jamal watched Langley carefully, knowing exactly where he was going with this. Reese responded evenly. "That's correct, but in this case, the driver did not de-escalate. He let the harassment continue, and when Miss Whitaker defended herself, he chose to remove her instead of the aggressor." Langley didn't falter. "Would you agree, Detective, that bus drivers are often put in difficult situations where they must make split-second decisions to avoid escalating conflict?" Reese gave a slow nod. "That may be true in some cases, but this was not a split-second decision. This was a conscious choice to remove a black woman from the bus rather than remove the man harassing her. That is not de-escalation. That is bias." Langley paused, his expression tightening, before turning toward the jury. "Metro Transit cannot be held accountable for every action taken by individual drivers," he argued. "They employ thousands of people. Some drivers make poor judgment calls, but that doesn't mean the entire system is at fault. Policies exist. Training is in place. At some point, individual responsibility must be considered." Jamal finally stepped forward. "Mr. Langley, let's talk about individual responsibility." His voice was calm, but there was a razor-sharp edge beneath it. He turned back to Detective Reese. Of those 14 complaints filed over the past 10 years, how many resulted in a driver being fired for failing to protect a black passenger? None. The room stiffened. Jamal turned back to Langley, his voice steady. You claim Metro Transit trains its employees to de-escalate conflict. Yet not one of those cases resulted in disciplinary action. Not one. So I ask you, Mr. Langley, if policies exist, if training exists, yet the same failures keep happening over and over again, at what point does it become more than just individual responsibility? At what point does it become systemic negligence? Langley opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. The jury was watching him. The press was watching him. And for the first time, it was clear that there was no defense that could erase what had just been laid bare. Jamal stepped back, giving one final look to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge gave a slow nod, her gaze flicking toward the defense, who looked paler than they had when the day started. The truth was out now, and no settlement, no shallow corporate statement, no empty apology was going to make it go away. The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak, the air thick with the weight of what was about to come. The entire room sat in near breathless silence, every pair of eyes trained on the jury as they filed back into their seats. The foreperson, a woman with an air of quiet certainty, held the verdict in her hands, the words that would decide the fate of both Earl Pritchard and the Metro Transit Bus Company. Dolores sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture unshaken, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had waited a lifetime for people like Earl to face the consequences of their actions, had endured too many moments where men like him walked away without a scratch, while women like her were left to carry the burden of it all. But today, she would not be the one carrying the weight. Today, the weight would belong to them. Jamal Hawkins sat beside her, his gaze sharp, his movements composed, his fingers lightly tapping against his notepad, a quiet show of confidence that told her he already knew the answer before it was spoken. He had fought this case with precision, had stripped away every excuse, every attempt at deflection, had turned Metro Transit's carefully constructed defenses into nothing more than empty words. And now, all that remained was the verdict. Across the room, Earl Pritchard looked like a man on the verge of breaking apart. His face was pale, his hands clenched so tightly against the table that his knuckles had gone white, his foot bouncing erratically beneath the desk. He had spent weeks trying to paint himself as the victim, clinging to the belief that if he just shouted loud enough, if he just convinced enough people, someone, anyone, would still believe in him. But now, as the jury's decision loomed before him, he finally understood the truth. No one believed him anymore. The judge turned toward the jury, her expression unreadable, her voice steady. As the jury reached a verdict, the foreperson stood, her presence commanding, her eyes scanning the room before she spoke. Yes, Your Honor, we have. A hush rippled through the courtroom, a stillness so thick that even the faintest shuffling of papers could be heard. The judge gave a small nod, gesturing for her to proceed. In the matter of Whitaker versus Pritchard, we find the defendant, Earl Pritchard, guilty of civil assault and harassment. A collective hush spread through the gallery, a moment of frozen time where the weight of those words settled over every person in the room. Then, it hit. A wave of emotion crashed over the courtroom, a mixture of relief, shock, and long overdue reckoning. Some gasped, others whispered, and still, others simply let the truth sink in. Dolores did not react right away. She remained still, taking in the moment, absorbing the reality that for once, justice had not looked away. Jamal turned toward her slightly, his expression calm but certain, offering the smallest of nods as if to say, "It's done." Across the room, Earl sputtered, his face turning beet red, his mouth opening and closing as if he was choking on his own rage. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice raw with disbelief, his fists slamming against the table. "I didn't do nothing wrong. She hit me first. I lost my damn job over this. My family." The judge's gavel struck down hard. "Mr. Pritchard, you are out of order," she warned, her tone as sharp as a blade. "One more outburst, and I will have you removed from this courtroom." Earl's mouth snapped shut, but his chest heaved with fury. He had spent his entire life getting away with his actions, had spent years learning that there would always be someone to excuse him, to dismiss his behavior, to let him continue as he always had. But today, he was out of excuses. The foreperson continued, "In the matter of Whitaker Versters, Metro Transit Bus Company, we find the defendant liable for negligence and failure to enforce anti-discrimination policies." That was the moment Dolores finally exhaled. It was over. The judge turned to the Metro Transit legal team, who sat stone-faced, their composure cracking at the edges. They had done everything in their power to make this case disappear, had tried to throw money at the problem, had hoped that the world would move on before they were forced to take responsibility. But the jury had seen through them, and now they would pay. In light of the jury's decision, the judge announced, Metro Transit Bus Company is ordered to pay Miss Whitaker a sum of $4 million in damages, both compensatory and punitive. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the flashing of cameras. The shockwave hit immediately. This wasn't just a victory. This was a reckoning. The number was not arbitrary. It was calculated, designed to send a message. Metro Transit had ignored racial harassment for years, had allowed incidents like Dolores's to happen without consequence, had turned a blind eye until it was no longer possible. Now, they would pay not just for what happened to her, but for every person they had failed to protect before her. Michael Langley, the lead attorney for Metro Transit, looked like he had swallowed glass. The settlement they had so arrogantly offered weeks ago, the money they had been willing to throw at Dolores just to make her go away, now paled in comparison to what they were actually being forced to pay. Jamal leaned in slightly toward Dolores, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just a win, Miss Whitaker," he said. "This sets a precedent. This means companies like Metro Transit can't just issue statements and move on. This means real change." Dolores nodded slowly, taking it all in. The past could not be rewritten. What had happened to her could not be erased. But this was justice. The judge turned her attention back to Earl, who sat deflated, his face twisted with fury, disbelief, and a realization that he had run out of people to blame. "In addition to the civil ruling, Mr. Pritchard is required to pay punitive damages," the judge stated. "Furthermore, a permanent restraining order will be issued, ensuring that Mr. Pritchard is never allowed to have contact with Miss Whitaker again." That final blow seemed to break whatever illusion Earl had been clinging to. His hands curled into fists, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ground together audibly. But there was nothing he could do. No one was coming to save him. The judge banged her gavel one last time. "Court is adjourned." The sound echoed through the chamber, sealing the moment into history. Cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled to document what had just happened. Activists exchanged knowing looks, aware that this case would be remembered. People whispered about what it would mean going forward, how it would change policies, how it would make it harder for companies like Metro Transit to turn a blind eye. And in the middle of it all, Dolores Whitaker sat quietly. She had not moved to the back of the bus. She had not been silenced. She had fought, and she had won. The ruling had not simply stayed within the confines of the courtroom. It had spread far beyond its walls, embedding itself into conversations that stretched across the city, reaching corporate boardrooms, slipping into government discussions, and igniting long-overdue debates that could no longer be ignored. Dolores Whitaker's case had started as one woman fighting for justice, but in its wake it had become something far greater. She had won. But her victory was no longer just about holding one man accountable or forcing a company to pay damages. It had turned into a movement, something larger than she had ever intended. The case had become a catalyst for systemic change, and this time, no one in power could ignore it. The very same company that had dismissed her as a problem to get rid of, that had attempted to buy her silence with a check, that had released meaningless statements filled with empty words, now found itself forced into a position where silence was no longer an option. The backlash Metro Transit faced in the weeks following the verdict was unrelenting. Public trust in their leadership collapsed as commuters voiced their outrage. Activists staged demonstrations in front of their headquarters, and local officials, facing pressure from their constituents, demanded immediate action. They could no longer hide behind carefully worded press releases. They could no longer ignore the truth that had been laid bare. And so, for the first time in their long history, they were forced to do something real. A month after the trial's conclusion, the mayor's office, standing alongside Metro Transit's top executives, held a press conference announcing sweeping reforms that would change public transportation policies across the city. Standing at the podium, the mayor spoke with carefully measured authority, her voice carrying the weight of the public's demand for justice. Effective immediately, all Metro Transit employees, including bus drivers, supervisors, and operations managers, will be required to undergo mandatory racial sensitivity and de-escalation training. This will not be optional. This will not be a single event. This will be part of an ongoing, enforced effort to ensure that what happened to Miss Whitaker never happens again. Her words, carefully chosen and delivered with the weight of an administration under pressure, marked a monumental shift in policy, one that would have been unthinkable just months before. But more importantly, they were not born out of goodwill or voluntary reflection. They were forced. The company had not changed because they wanted to. They had changed because they had no choice. For too long, the cries of victims had been ignored, dismissed, or buried under bureaucracy. But this time, the world had been watching, and it would not look away. The conversation refused to fade. It grew louder with each passing day. News outlets continued to cover the trial's aftermath. Legal analysts debated its implications, and civil rights groups pointed to it as a turning point. Across the country, activists and attorneys began examining other transit systems, looking into their own histories of negligence, searching for more cases that had been quietly swept away. And then, something even bigger happened. The movement began to spread. In other cities, Black passengers who had suffered similar treatment came forward, sharing their stories for the first time, no longer willing to endure their experiences in silence. Organizers in other states called for their own public transportation systems to implement the same mandatory training Metro Transit had been forced to adopt. Protests formed in front of transit buildings in places that had nothing to do with Dolores's case, but where people recognized that what had happened to her was not an isolated event, but a pattern woven into the very fabric of the system. One evening, as Dolores sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea resting in front of her, she turned on the news. The anchor, her voice sharp with urgency, stood in front of another city's transit headquarters, covering a growing demonstration. Behind her, a crowd had gathered, filling the sidewalks, their chants rising over the traffic. Some held signs with Dolores's face on them. Others waved placards that read, "We stand with Dolores." For a long time, she simply watched. The mug in her hands warmed her fingers, but the warmth inside her chest came from something far deeper. She had never wanted to become a symbol. She had never sought recognition or fame. She had never fought for anything other than her dignity. And yet, here she was, watching strangers, people she had never met, people who had never met her, take up the same fight she had started, refusing to let it end with a single court ruling. She had won, and because she had won, others now had the courage to fight. For years, she had believed that standing up for herself was simply about protecting her own rights. But now, she understood that it had never just been about her. Jamal Hawkins had told her this from the very beginning. "This case is bigger than you," he had said. "This is about every person who has ever been told to sit down, to be quiet, to endure. This is about making sure that people like Earl Pritchard no longer get to walk away unscathed." And he had been right. Her case had shown the world something that it had tried to ignore for too long. That change only happens when people refuse to move. The money she had won in the lawsuit would give her comfort. But that was never what had mattered to her the most. It was never about a check. It was never about personal gain. It had always been about holding power accountable. It had always been about forcing change where it was needed most. She had not won just for herself. She had won for everyone who had ever been forced to carry the weight of injustice alone. And now, things could never go back to the way they were before. The city had not transformed overnight, but Dolores could feel the shift, subtle yet undeniable, in the way people looked at her, in the way her name had taken on a weight beyond that of just one woman in a courtroom, in the way her fight had forced a conversation that could no longer be swept aside. The exhaustion that had settled deep in her bones over the years, the frustration of always having to fight for respect that should have been given freely, the quiet but constant anger at a world that expected her to endure indignities without complaint, had not vanished entirely, but it had lightened. The battle had tested her resolve in ways she had not anticipated, stretching longer and reaching farther than she ever imagined. But in the end, she had won. And because she had won, others would not have to endure what she had. Weeks had passed since the verdict, and though the world had begun shifting its attention toward other headlines, she knew that what she had done would not simply disappear into history as another forgotten case. The policies that had been put in place, the conversations that had been forced into the public sphere, the knowledge that companies like Metro Transit could no longer hide behind empty statements and vague promises, all remained. She had spent her life understanding that real change did not come quickly, that victories were rarely swift or absolute. But this time, the system had been forced to bend, and the mark she had left on it would not fade. For years, she had stepped onto buses knowing that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, carrying the unspoken understanding that at any moment someone might decide she did not belong, that she needed to move, that she needed to make herself smaller so that others could remain. Comfortable in their own entitlement, the expectation had always been that she would accept it, that she would bear the weight of history in silence, that she would shrink herself so the world did not have to confront its own ugliness. But today was different, and as she approached the bus stop, she carried herself with the quiet certainty of a woman who no longer had to justify her place. The bus arrived with a low hiss, the doors swinging open to reveal a new driver behind the wheel. He looked at her briefly, his expression neutral, his gaze passing over her without hesitation or discomfort. She stepped inside, moving through the familiar space as the warm afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long streaks of gold against the seats. She did not brace herself for confrontation. She did not wonder if someone would challenge her right to sit where she pleased. She walked with a measured pace, deliberate and unhurried, past the rows of passengers who barely spared her a glance, past the uneasy weight of history that had once pressed down on her shoulders. When she reached the front, she settled into her seat, not as an act of defiance, not as a statement, not because she needed to prove anything to anyone, but because it was where she had chosen to be. The bus rumbled beneath her feet as it pulled away from the curb, slipping back into the rhythm of the city, moving through streets that had been unchanged by her battle, yet different in a way that only she could feel. The world outside blurred past the window, buildings rising and falling in a steady cadence, people rushing along sidewalks, cars weaving through intersections, life continuing as it always had. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the quiet presence of someone watching her. A few rows away, A young black girl sat with her hands wrapped around the straps of her backpack, her dark eyes wide with something unspoken, something that was not quite admiration, not quite gratitude, but something deeper. Dolores met her gaze, recognizing in that silent moment the weight of what had passed between them. There was no need for words, no need for acknowledgement beyond the understanding that this moment would never be as heavy for the girl as it had been for her, that this child would grow up knowing a world where someone had fought before she ever had to. A slow, knowing smile crossed Dolores's lips, and after a pause, the girl returned it, her expression filled with the quiet hope of someone who had witnessed something important, even if she did not yet have the words to define it. Turning her gaze back to the window, Dolores let her thoughts settle into the steady hum of the bus as it carried her forward, allowing herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply exist without the expectation of a fight. The journey she had taken, the weight of it, the impact of what she had done, would not disappear with time, would not be erased by the next controversy or the next battle waiting to be fought. It would remain, embedded into policies, carried forward by the people who had marched because of her, spoken of by those who had been emboldened to stand their ground because she had refused to move. She had not just won in the courtroom. She had won something far greater. The money she had been awarded would allow her comfort, would ensure that she could live without the financial strain that had once burdened her. But that was not the victory she carried with her now. This moment, this quiet, simple moment of sitting on a bus without fear, without hesitation, without the feeling of waiting for something to go wrong, was the victory that mattered most. She had reclaimed what had been denied to her, and she had ensured that no one else would have to fight the same battle alone. Justice had been served, not just in legal documents or policy changes, but in something more profound, something that could not be measured in court rulings or dollar amounts. It had been served in the ease with which she could now sit in her seat without looking over her shoulder, in the certainty that the next time someone like Earl Pritchard tried to strip another woman of her dignity, there would be consequences, and there would be a precedent set to hold them accountable. She exhaled slowly, feeling the tension that had lived in her body for so long begin to unravel, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her shoulders settling against the seat as the city moved around her. This was how it was always supposed to be, and finally it was. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.